Welcome to the chaos sector. We return to the matrix. The mainstream media has always been a key element in this case. Not once have they given Koberger the benefit of the doubt, despite the conflicting evidence and information presented that indicates at the very least he didn't act alone. I mean, if there are 3 additional males' DNA discovered at the crime scene and blood left at the crime scene by those males, shouldn't the mainstream media give a more optimistic approach in how they report on the case? Of course, but what is the reason for this blatant bias, despite conflicting information and evidence presented? It's not so much about slandering Koberger, rather, more so about protecting the college circle. I want to briefly go over our polls in regards to the consensus. In the consensus poll regarding who provides the best trail to follow, it is none other than Dylan who provides the best trail to follow, at 67%. Bethany second, at 16%, fraternities and sororities third at 10%, Jack Showalter fourth at 7%. Now, although we agree Dylan is the best trail to follow, that trail comes to a screeching halt. Her trail ends in the courtroom, and it appears she will not testify. So this leaves Bethany, Jack Showalter, fraternities and sororities. I think Bethany will be willing to testify, due to not only the previous willingness to testify in the preliminary hearing, but also due to the recent information revealed, that is showing she was not a non-factor that night, as far as witness accounts. With that fear, Bethany would want to testify to clear her name. She's almost forced to do so, because with every unsealed document, it creates a setting in the home where Bethany was not only awake, but knew of the danger and ultimately the murders. Jack Showalter is another key player, because he warned Kaylee and Madison prior that night. We've always focused on this issue, that's a trail. A bit surprised at the low percentage of voters who think he isn't one of the best trails, to be honest. Think about it, to this point, there has not been any information that proves his warning was related to anything different than the danger they faced later on. As a result, Jack Showalter warned them about the very danger they faced later on. Perhaps they didn't seem 100% concerned about it, yet it's evident the warning was about that danger. This means Showalter also knew the motive behind the murders. And knowing the motive behind the murders means Showalter should be summoned to testify. But that would possibly happen in a second investigation and second trial after Koberger has been found not guilty. The main reason Showalter's warning was about the danger is due to the mainstream media literally running away from it. They never inquired about what he referred to. Heck, they even edited out that segment of footage and audio, while simultaneously so-called inquiring about what Madison told Adam. How can you focus on what Madison told Adam when the question posed to Madison by Kaylee was in relation to Jack's warning? You see this shit? We broke this down, but again, the reason they avoided that inquiry about Jack's warning is because it would obviously bring attention to what Showalter knew for one, but it would also force law enforcement to question him about what he knew. Now, they already did this, but behind closed doors, you see. It wasn't a part of any police report. He didn't have any witness accounts of what he knew or saw that night. He was cleared in the background, yet obviously knew Kaylee and Madison were in danger. The fraternities and sororities, well, we all know they're being protected the most. Big money generates throughout those organizations. It does the talking, unfortunately. Now, let's address the recent claims about the setting in the home. Yep, they keep dragging Dylan under the bus. She's gonna have skid marks before it's all said and done.
Yeah, she's getting scraped up pretty bad. Could have done something about it. Nevertheless, examining Exhibit D1, it says, quote, Dylan exited her room and began running toward Bethany's bedroom. On her way, she noticed Xana lying on the floor of her bedroom, with her head towards the wall and her feet toward the door. Dylan thought Xana was drunk, unquote. Again, this was not in her official affidavit for obvious reasons. Yet because the state has no problem in throwing her under the bus, they unseal it, and it flat out contradicts the setting in the home based on Dylan's affidavit. And it also means that Dylan was never frozen in a shocked phase. She was active, texting Bethany, calling her housemates, and even ran to Bethany's room. But in the affidavit, completely different chain of events. It stated that after seeing the alleged Koberger walk past, closed her door, locked it, and went to sleep at some point. No mention of even communicating with Bethany, yet alone physically running to her room. If there is conflicting accounts of where Dylan physically was at any point, it doesn't matter if it seems insignificant to some. If there is conflicting accounts of her location, it changes the setting in the home. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. Dylan is running to Bethany's room downstairs, as shown here. On her way there, she saw Xana lying on the floor. Stop, right here. This is the devastating point. It claims that Dylan thought she was drunk, justifying the reason she was lying on the floor, right? Then this changes everything. Let me explain. What would be your reason for running downstairs to Bethany's room? if Xana was merely passed out from drinking. According to this setting, where you never checked on her, hey, it's just Xana drunk after partying. So shouldn't Dylan feel a sense of calm once she realized there was nothing to be scared of? Oh wait, she's still scared of something? Oh, it was the male she saw, right? But in another interview, Dylan stated she wasn't, I repeat, she wasn't scared or thought anything of the male, as she assumed he was a partygoer. Really? A partygoer dressed in all black with a fucking mask creeping past you? Make up your mind, either he creeped you out or you thought nothing of him, as you assumed he was a partygoer. Can't make your mind up when you're lying. If you saw this male on the same floor that you saw Xana passed out on the floor, wouldn't you check to see if Xana was okay? What if that male attacked Xana, right? So let me see here. You've so-called assumed Xana was simply drunk, yet was concerned about a male in all black with a mask walked past you on the same floor Xana was on. I don't think the mainstream media nor the state truly thinks the public is stupid. They just don't have any real way to hide the truth anymore. So of course her accounts will become more and more absurd the closer you get to the truth. Let's examine this absurdity. Quote, at approximately 11:50 a.m., Dylan called her friend, Emily, and asked her to cover and check the house because she was scared, unquote. Now briefly, at 11:50 a.m. Sunday morning, Dylan was scared. What about throughout wee hours of Sunday, when it was dark, when you couldn't get in touch with anyone? Or when you saw a man in all black with a mask on, in the home? You weren't scared then? Anywho, Emily and her boyfriend Hunter came over. They met Dylan and Bethany at the bottom floor of the house. Okay, so Hunter and Emily came through the main entrance. Together, Dylan, Bethany, and Hunter started to walk up the stairs to the second floor. When they reached the second floor, Hunter went to the kitchen to grab a kitchen knife. Wait, so this indicates that Hunter went to grab a kitchen knife to potentially engage the intruder, right? Sounds more like what Ethan would have done, to be honest. But nevertheless, quote, when he came back out, Dylan saw Xana again for a split second. And I just started bawling because I thought she had just, I don't even know. I thought maybe she was still just drunk and all asleep on the floor. Unquote, this is madness. Noticed it doesn't say Hunter saw Xana lying on the floor. It says, quote, when he came back out, Dylan saw Xana for a split second. Unquote. Why are they mentioning Dylan seeing Xana when it was Hunter who had arrived at the home and clearly would have seen Xana on the floor? I'll get into why. Dylan already saw Xana prior. Why mention she saw her again? It doesn't prove anything. To reach the kitchen from the first floor, Hunter would have to pass Xana's bedroom and would obviously look in that direction. Yet it doesn't state Hunter saw her. Here's why. If it stated Hunter saw Xana, then this would prompt him to go check on her at that very moment, you see? And the phone call which indicated he discovered them deceased would have already occurred prior to the call, and then the 911 call would have been about that deceased housemate. Of course, you see how slick they attempt to hide the details? Slick, but not slick enough. They need more WD-40. I'm done with this crap.
Yep, just more frustration. It claims that Hunter went to the kitchen to grab a knife, suggesting that he was preparing to engage with an intruder. But we know he never reached the kitchen, because once he saw Xana lying on the floor, he went to the room and also saw Ethan on the floor deceased. Yes, Hunter, upon arrival, before any 911 call was made, knew Ethan and Xana were murdered. Now after this, perhaps he went to the kitchen to grab a knife, just out of panic and uncertainty. Let's simulate how this played out, because it once again proves the 911 call was made to allow the authorities to deal with it. The reason being is because if they called about deceased housemates, then everything tracks back to the events prior. And that would definitely put Dylan in a horrible position, Bethany as well. Hunter goes upstairs. Naturally, he will look to his right and spot Xana lying on the floor, just like Dylan did prior. Once he sees Xana, naturally, he will go over to check everything out. And that's when he freaks out. Hunter has just witnessed Xana's deceased body on the floor, and Ethan as well. He perhaps collapses for a moment, and then at this moment he may have rushed to the kitchen to grab a knife. According to the setting in the 911 audio, everyone is on the second floor at this point. Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and Emily, and two neighbors who had arrived at some point. Let's dig a bit deeper into this fuckery. Quote, Hunter told Dylan and Bethany to get out. Emily, who had started up the stairs, also turned around after Hunter instructed her not to come any further. Now, this is the same scenario of Hunter seeing Xana lying on the floor, and then getting closer to notice she was deceased. But they reversed the chain of events to justify the 911 call. Again, so we're on the same page here. The call would have been about deceased housemates. The same panic, crying, and telling everyone to get out would be when Hunter noticed Xana prior. Quote, they both went outside. Shortly afterwards, Hunter exited the house and told them to call 911. He was pale white and mentioned something about someone being unconscious. Unquote. Wait a minute, what? Did they claim that's what happened? Are they sticking with this claim? Mentioned something about someone being unconscious? So everyone was apparently outside at this point, because it says that Hunter and Emily exited the house and them told them to call 911. So Dylan and Bethany are outside at this point as well. But if Hunter told them to get out prior to the 911 call, then this means he noticed something, that being a deceased body, and didn't want anyone to see the gruesome scene in Xana's bedroom. We know they saw it, but for the sake of this fuckery scenario. Then this same scenario is played out once more in the 911 call, where Hunter goes and checks on Xana and is telling everyone to get out. What the hell is this? That had already happened, remember? It clearly states Hunter told Dylan and Bethany to get out or away from Xana's bedroom, and Emily, who was going upstairs, turned away. This is before, I repeat, before the 911 call. Then shortly after, they all exited the home and Hunter told the housemates to call 911. Then he repeats the very actions he had already. You know what? Let's play that segment of audio to really magnify the fuckery.
So Hunter told them to get out or away from Xana's room twice. This would mean the first time, you know what, let's break it down, they're crumbling right before everyone's eyes here. When it's describing Hunter going upstairs and going to the kitchen to get a knife, it doesn't elaborate on what his activities were during this time frame. It switches back to Dylan, claiming she saw Xana again for a split second. What about Hunter seeing Xana, right? In addition, what is Hunter doing at this moment with a knife and on the second floor, and obviously Xana's body is visible? Remember, this is prior to the 911 call. What it appears to be is that they merely reenacted their previous discovery prior to the 911 call. In that dynamic, the call was staged because they had already discovered Xana so-called unconscious. Individuals were told to get out, and then the call was made, which just played that scenario out once again. Now, we come to the conclusion that this was to keep the actual murders a secret. Yet, there seems to be a reporting brain fart. To mention Hunter had already went to Xana's bedroom and discovered her, quote, unconscious, prior to the 911 call. Was this a brain fart? Or was it a case of slipping out the truth, throwing them under the bus? I think it was to slip out the truth. What do you guys think? Think about it, that entire interaction with Dispatch is not a genuine discovery at that moment. Well, obviously, but for the sake of it all. The so-called genuine discovery occurred when Hunter went upstairs, walked a few steps towards the direction of the kitchen, and looked to his right and saw Xana lying on the floor. That would be the genuine discovery. And well, we just broke all of that down. It's out of control. And then there's more. I mean, the trial should be dismissed because this is just flat out bonkers. Quote, after spending the evening out, roommates Dylan, Bethany, Kaylee, and Madison returned to their home in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. Wait, it says Madison Morgan, not Madison Mogan. How do you get her last name incorrect in this exhibit? Gonsalves was spelled correctly, and that's a last name that's clearly more difficult to remember. Forgetting the last name indicates that Madison is an afterthought compared to Kaylee. And this is the narrative that was pushed, that Kaylee was somehow the focus out of the four victims. Not getting one of the victims' last name correct, which is being presented in the court documents by the way, shows how they're so concerned about a narrative instead of the facts. And they have the nerve to highlight this as facts? When you have Madison's last name wrong. Let's continue. At approximately 2 a.m., they met up in Kaylee's bedroom and talked for a while before going to bed. Now wait a minute. What the hell is this? Where in the world did they pull this out Dylan's fuzzy memory? Because this is not in her official affidavit. It's not in either of the interviews she had. We'll come back to this. Let's try to continue. Quote, the fifth roommate, Xana, who was out with her boyfriend Ethan, was not home yet. Okay, wait one more minute. So based on this account, which seems to be from Dylan, or even Bethany, doesn't matter which one because it conflicts with everything else any damn way, based on this account, Ethan and Xana were not home at 2 a.m. Now we know the questions that come about from this conflicting claim. Let's put that to the side for now. Rather, let's focus on the 2 a.m. arrival back home. Because initially it was reported that Dylan and Bethany arrived back home around 1 a.m. Then it was only Dylan who arrived back at 1 a.m. and Bethany arrived back around 1:45 a.m. with Ethan and Xana. This is a load of garbage. Didn't we tell everyone this would happen? If anyone is still around from our investigative series, We knew the prosecution would eventually crumble. And you're seeing it right now. I come back, and I'm already exhausted. Quote, the roommates debated going out to a food truck for a late snack, prompting Dylan to send a text at 2:10 a.m. to an Uber driver she knew, to see if he was driving. Ultimately, however, the girls decided to just go to bed. Unquote. You know, I can't do it. This is unacceptable. I'm done.
Not even sure where to start in breaking this nonsense down. Let's start with the claim that everyone apparently met up in Kaylee's bedroom for a while. This would be around 2 a.m., excluding Ethan and Xana. So Dylan, Bethany, Kaylee, and Madison were on the third floor, quote, talking for a while before going to bed. But this definitely can't be true, because Kaylee and Madison were making phone calls to Jack, assumed to be Jack D., starting around 2:30 a.m., and Dylan was still awake also, due to her texting her so-called Uber friend around 2:10 a.m., communicating during that time frame, and also creating a new contact in her phone around 3:51 a.m. Within this time frame, nobody was asleep. Going to bed could be seen as just going to their bedrooms, that's fine, but it still doesn't matter. Dylan never mentioned meeting with Kaylee and Madison upstairs in her affidavit, nor in her interviews. If you're following, the truth is slowly being pulled out of her the closer we get to the trial. You see? Now, they changed the chain of events here, where Dylan texts the Uber driver to, quote, go out for a late snack, but in her text messages released, it is depicted as inquiring if Kaylee and Madison were being driven back home. And that wouldn't be an Uber driver, rather a private driver. Which one is it here? Why would they want to go out for a late snack when they were all just out, including Kaylee and Madison, at the food truck prior? It says the roommates debated going out to a food truck. Kaylee and Madison just left the food truck and was driven home from there. So they're not going back out. So is this Dylan and Bethany? Let's untangle it. I think the reason they claim the text to the Uber driver was for a late snack is because if it were to check to see if Kaylee and Madison were being driven home, it would contradict the claim they arrived back at 1:56 a.m. Oh, the webs being weaved here is astonishing. In addition, using the term Uber driver instead of private driver changes the service somewhat. The private driver was allegedly familiar with those housemates, while an Uber driver can be a bit random. As we see here, it states that Dylan knew the Uber driver, right? This would be allegedly Eric Gower. So are they suggesting that Dylan knew Eric Gower? No offense, but Eric Gower, who works at the university, would have absolutely no reason to be associated with Dylan. Sorry, but that's just the reality. Let me address this for a moment. Eric Gower, who works at the university, was previously a university driver. This was when he was on the lower ranks of the outreach program, where he engaged with students all the time, taking them on hiking trips and such, providing transportation around town, including back and forth from class. But Gower got promoted to assistant director. Then he became head director of the program, meaning the higher the promotions, the less physical engagement he would have with the students. That's just how promotions work, my friends. And the previous job he left behind, someone else would take on that role. In addition to more responsibility as head director, he also was married with children. There is no way he's driving around on Saturday nights. And that's not even the most damaging part. The one who claimed to be the private driver, interviewed by Law and Crime, stated he was retired, was a private driver, and stayed 1,200 feet from Koberger's doorstep, meaning he stayed in Pullman, not Idaho. Eric Gower is from Idaho and has never resided in Pullman. So there, it's not Eric Gower. The person Dylan was in contact with is suspicious because it's not Eric Gower, yet that's the person being depicted as the driver. You know what, we broke all of that down already. Nonsense. Batman can't escape his guilt, simple as that. Also, do you notice they don't clarify when Ethan and Xana arrived back home? In this context, they mentioned they hadn't arrived back home around 2 a.m., so this means they're still out, right? Yet somehow, they arrived back home in the setting later in Dylan's accounts, where she heard crying coming from her bedroom, and she attempted to contact the housemates. If you mentioned Xana and Ethan hadn't arrived home yet, don't you think it's important to mention when they arrived? From other accounts, they arrived back home around 12 a.m., eating pizza. This was stated by Xana's father, remember? This is before Dylan arrives at home as well. Then, in another account, they arrived back around 1:45 a.m., yet here, they hadn't arrived back home around this time, approximately 2 a.m. And if we even go back to one of the initial reports, Moscow PD reported they had no clue where Ethan and Xana were between the time 9 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. This is literally garbage. We're rummaging through it as much as we can here. This is an example of a classic panic attack by the prosecution because they have underestimated the public, especially the true crime community. They thought the frame would go over smoothly until the public started calling out the glaring oddities. And it's like an avalanche of absurdity, because with every unsealed document regarding the surviving housemates' accounts, it just throws them under the bus even deeper. Is there conflicting reports about Kaylee and Madison's whereabouts? Nope, and this is due to everything being seen in surveillance, except for their arrival, which hasn't been proven due to the mystery surrounding the neighbor's security camera footage. Ethan and Xana, though, they made everything fuzzy with those two because there is no visual evidence to justify their whereabouts. No party footage showing them there, no TikTok footage of them at home. We have to take law enforcement's word for it. But maybe this account claims they weren't at home at 2 a.m. because Ethan did in fact get into a physical altercation, and that altercation could be linked to their murders. Nevertheless, we know Dylan's whereabouts were not confirmed because she was somewhere that is linked to someone or a group of persons that is also linked to the murders. No other conclusion. Coming back to the audio for a moment, someone left a post about what was possibly stated in the whispering in that audio. Quote, "That whispering sounds like she warned Kaylee," unquote. Now we went back and examined that segment, and it does sound like that was stated. Of course, we know that the brain can be conditioned to hear whatever is suggested, yet this is highly possible. Let's listen to that segment again to see if we can confirm it. Now we do detect a word starting with the shush sound, which can be the word she, should, show. I mean, that's about it. You know, we suggested that it was, quote, show me, unquote. That's possible. The stress factor of the second word, though, does sound like the word warned. The ending, we do hear a word that starts with the letter K or C. She warned Kaylee. That does sound accurate. And the thing about it is that warning to Kaylee aligns with the warning that Jack Showalter gave the girls earlier that night. If this is Dylan, could she be referring to Bonnie? Perhaps Bonnie warned Kaylee sometime prior? Maybe Bonnie came and warned Kaylee after Showalter had warned them prior. And this is when they took it seriously, which prompted them to call Jack around 2:30 a.m. And Jack D was definitely not answering because he knew what was going down as well. Ex-girlfriend doesn't take priority over his life being threatened. That's how they see it, of course. We've always believed it was Jack Showalter who was called, not the ex-boyfriend. Yeah, we know the report claims the girls called him. But haven't you been keeping up? There's so much misdirection in this case, you'll get lost. And that was the plan. We can even suggest they called both Jacks, and neither one of them answered. But we've always believed Showalter was called for sure, because his warning was about an hour prior, and all of a sudden Kaylee and Madison are frantically calling. And then those attempts came to an end at 3 a.m. About 10 minutes later, we see at least 4 individuals running from the neighborhood, around 3:12 a.m. What if the killers were actually caught on camera, leaving the home after committing the murders? Were they questioned? Because even the mainstream media pointed it out, right? Oh, wait a minute. It all makes sense. Does anyone remember our episode breaking down Taylor Avenue and Madison's black coat? If you recall, the detectives are seen traveling to, I believe it's Alpha Lambda or something of the sorts. Gotta go back and check that. It's the Fraternity on Nez Perce Drive, if memory serves me. And we asked why were detectives going all the way there, which was extending their investigation to that area. Mind you, this is all before Kohberger was so-called identified. If the mainstream media pointed it out, and so-called inquired about those shadowy figures running away from the neighborhood, we know for certain Moscow PD investigated. And this is why detectives are seen traveling to that fraternity. Huda London did a great job in pointing out that Saeed apparently was watching something on his phone, which she assumed could have been the attacks and murders being recorded. We don't necessarily agree, but what we focused on more so was how bushy his eyebrows were, and the size of his hands. Bare hands that could strangle one of those girls with ease. And his presence outside at that time did appear to be a decoy. Have to go back and check the exact time of his encounter in Banfield. Believe it was around 2:50 a.m. Madison called Bethany around this time as well. We know the fraternities and sororities were involved. Powerful people are keeping them protected. Keep in mind, Showalter's warning is linked to the motive. And the motive, based on our investigation, and predominantly the true crime community, is centered around drugs. Bonnie was a drug pusher in town with Clyde, so Kaylee and Madison were warned. And Dylan, thinking about what unfolded in her regret, whispers she warned Kaylee not to betray the pushers, and all of the victims were linked to that betrayal. In addition, it claims that Dylan and Bethany were upstairs with Kaylee and Madison around 2 a.m., right? Yet, they never are depicted as going upstairs either in the exhibit's accounts, nor the 911 audio. Why is that? Why is there no mention of anyone going upstairs to check on Kaylee and Madison? The knife sheath was discovered, quote, slightly under Madison's body in one report. Then another claims it was discovered next to her body. We're going with slightly under. This creates a setting where it's possible that Madison's body was placed in her bed, slightly on top of the knife sheath. Or get this, her body was lifted slightly, then the knife sheath was placed under her. Just trying to figure it out, you know? Hunter goes to the kitchen to grab a knife, suggesting he's preparing to engage with an intruder. But may we suggest something that may be a bit shocking? Is it possible that Hunter used that knife to finish Xana off? I know that may touch a nerve for some, but it's not like he doesn't have a suspicious vibe about him. What if Xana was still alive, still breathing on the ground, crying, sighing, and nobody knew what to do at that moment? Knowing that the other housemates were already murdered, Hunter made a grave decision. He decided to stab Xana. She grabbed the knife with her dying strength, and this is how her fingers were almost severed. Whoa, that's very dreadful, but also possible. Hunter didn't want Dylan, Bethany, and Emily to see it, though, and told them to what? Keep in mind, this audio is not everyone discovering Xana so-called unconscious. This was so-called discovered prior, when Hunter told them to get out. They all went outside, allegedly, and then this is when Hunter told them to call 911. Again, think carefully here. Why would they reenact the discovery of Xana being so-called unconscious? They could have just called when Hunter discovered her prior and then claimed she was unconscious. They decided to do that anyway, right? Here's a theory. Let's explore it for a moment. Maybe it's because Xana was still alive, and this is when Hunter told everyone to get out and away from her bedroom, in which he could have finished her off at that point. If Xana was still alive at that point, yet the other housemates were deceased, it creates a problem, because if she had survived, obviously her experience would be totally different from all this garbage Dylan's account claim. And when you factor in the motive behind those murders, those peers would be caught between a rock and a hard place. Do they call 911 and say that Xana is a housemate that is still alive from a brutal attack? Or do you just finish her off and there is no one left alive from that brutal attack? What would you do in that situation if you were Hunter? Keep in mind, Ethan is deceased. Hunter decided, well, they can at least be together forever. Sounds demented, but in that brutal reality, Hunter just tapped out and decided to make sure Ethan and Xana would live on in spirit together. Wow. We've gone down a very dark path here, yet it was already dark. When we read that segment of the exhibit mentioning Hunter going to grab a knife from the kitchen, we immediately thought of this, because he wouldn't get to the kitchen before seeing Xana's body. Also, Dylan wouldn't have been scared at 11:50 a.m. That fear would have been during the attacks, during the murders, and throughout the wee hours while it was still dark. So the reason for Hunter to go grab a knife, in our eyes, isn't justified by Dylan being scared upon the call to Emily. It was to finish an actual surviving housemate off, that being Xana, who was still alive. Dylan and Bethany didn't know what to do about it. They couldn't call 911 at that point because she was still alive. Explaining what her condition was would consist of some sort of bodily harm, you see? So they called Hunter and Emily over, and Hunter decided it was best to allow Xana to rest in peace with the love of her life. And that would explain why they reenacted the so-called discovery.
Hold on, I just thought of something as you were going through that theory. And everyone should understand that is possible, you know. Who did Dylan call at 4:27 a.m.? We assumed it was Batman, who she added into her contacts. But what if it was the next door neighbors? Perhaps didn't have their numbers, so it makes sense that she would add them in her contacts. The new contact may be the neighbors. I don't think they were actually friends, just neighbors, you know. But the outgoing call, though, at 4:27 a.m., now that's a major problem. Because if we go with the time of death, approximately around this time frame, then Dylan called someone soon after the alleged Kohberger left the home, right? Now who would this mysterious person be? Again, after seeing the alleged Kohberger walk past her, she runs to Bethany's room, attempts to contact the victims, but within this time frame, she made a call to someone who has not been identified. What if it was Hunter? Now you may say they would have provided his initials, verifying Dylan called him at 4:27 a.m. Not so fast, they wouldn't dare do that. Because he would have come over to the house, Dylan would have claimed she was, quote, scared, and Hunter would go upstairs to the kitchen and grab a knife to defend the home. You see what I just did there? What if Hunter and Emily were there soon after? And we apply the same scenario where Xana was still alive after the attacks, you see. Then just play everything out later on, as if they just arrived and discovered Xana, quote, unconscious. Highly logical, I would say. Out of all the communication via those phone records, the added contact was not verified, but more so, the call Dylan made at 4:27 a.m., that person's initials weren't given. Every other individual called or text, their initials were given. Even Dylan's dad was mentioned in those records. Bethany's parents were also mentioned. That individual Dylan called at 4:27 a.m. was never identified in any manner. If this was in fact Hunter, they wouldn't identify him at this time, because obviously Dylan would call him about the setting in the home. You see? And that just blows everything up. Hunter and Emily arrive. Xana is still alive on the floor around 4:30 a.m., and they decided to, well, put her out of her misery. It's controversial, but definitely logical. Then now they're really caught in a jam, because Hunter actually murdered Xana. There was blood DNA from a male on the stair rail, bridged from the first and second floor. Hunter and Emily arrived from the front entrance, not the sliding doors. What if this is Hunter's blood, after being scratched by Xana, as she fought for her life against him? He then leaves, goes home, cleans himself up, and they simply wait until sunrise to deal with the situation. We know that this is a fact, regardless of the new theory. It is a fact they waited till sunrise to actually deal with the massacre. You know, I'll stop right here, getting a bit ahead of myself.
Putting it all into context here, we know for a fact that they knew the housemates were murdered. So the call about an unconscious housemates was thrown out the window years ago. So that leaves the setting of pretending to discover an unconscious housemate. Okay, yet based on the exhibit's accounts of that discovery, it occurred prior to the 911 call, which was depicted as when the discovery occurred. So the reenactment of it, or pretending, is conspiratorial, obviously, a cover-up. And when you have a cover-up, in this circumstance, you're covering up murders. Willing to do that aligns with taking a knife and finishing a housemate off to silence one of the victims, again covering up the murders. There was a consequence that those housemates couldn't avoid, and nobody had the courage to stand up against the threat. We understand they were scared. But if you're not willing to stand for something, you'll fall for anything, even if it means deciding to finish off the remaining victim to cover everything up. I know this is touching, but our job is to break things down as much as possible. Investigating is about getting to the truth, and that takes the courage to explore things that some may not want to address. This is the chaos sector.